Well, good evening, everyone. I'm David Blight, and I'm the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale. Welcome to all of you. It's nice to see so many people. I was going to say, come out tonight on a snowstorm night, but you're all inside and snug, I hope. We're going to have as many as 100 people on here tonight, so thank you all for coming. It's a special event for us to bring back Amy Murrell Taylor, last year's winner of the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Well, let me introduce Amy and we'll get right down to it. This is going to be a conversation about a book, which is in some ways the most fun we have of these events. Amy Murrell Taylor is currently teaches American history at the University of Kentucky, where she is the Marshall Hahn Professor of American History. She did her BA at Duke University and her PhD at the University of Virginia. She wrote an earlier book called The Divided Family in the Civil War back in 2005. She has also won what they call the Great Teaching Award at the University of Kentucky. I think that's terrific and should always be mentioned. But we're here to talk about this prize-winning book. It's won 3 major prizes. Excuse me, dropped my notes. Embattled Freedom, Journeys Through the Civil War's Slave Refugee Camps, published by the University of North Carolina Press. It won the Merrill Curdy Prize of the Organization of American Historians. It won the Tom Watson Prize of the Society of Civil War Historians. It's been a finalist for some other prizes, and it has won prizes for very good reasons. It's an innovative book. It's a book of extraordinary research, and it's a book telling a story that is so important to the Civil War era and so important in African-American history, but a story that we've never quite gotten this close to, if I do say so. Amy, welcome back to the GLC, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
To talk about this book. Yeah, I owe Amy one because she did this with me last year on my Douglass book for the Kentucky Book Festival, and we had a great time doing that. Let's start at the large scale level, if we could. How does emancipation become such a colossal and significant aspect of this war across the landscape of the South, to the point where thousands, first hundreds in a trickle, and then thousands of refugee African-American slaves begin to come toward the Union Army and eventually into these refugee camps. Help our audience understand the scale of this story and how it came about.
Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't just come about in one moment. And I think that's, the way that we talk about emancipation often does sort of locate it in particular moments. But it starts at the very beginning of the war. I mean, literally the first days of the war. And it is really pushed forward by literally the footsteps of enslaved people themselves, who recognize that this war is their opportunity, that this war is the one, this will mean freedom. They at least have their willingness to risk their lives on that assumption. And so we start seeing from the very first days of the war, men, women, and children who show up to Union Army installations in the South and offer their labor, pointing out that if you allow us into Union lines and we can work for you, you are taking labor away from the Confederacy, hurting our common enemy. And this began, again, at the very beginning of the war. The United States, the Union officials aren't always willing to let them in. They are fighting a war to defend federal policy and law, and some believe the Fugitive Slave Act still holds and turn them away.
Yeah, there's no certainty, is there, at the beginning of the war, and actually for the first year and a half of the war. If you escaped somehow to a Union Army or the Union lines, there's no certainty that this is going to mean freedom. And even if it meant freedom, people couldn't know yet what that meant,
Well,
right?
I think uncertainty is sort of the common thread through this whole story.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And so it's enormous. It's a huge risk that people take. So
Oh,
this
yeah.
is not, we can't assume that once people start fleeing and then others just kind of come and piggyback on them because the way has been paved. There's no smooth path for any of them. And, you know, there's a lot of fear that permanent freedom is not going to result, but you know, this is the best chance that they've had. And so beginning in Virginia in May 1861, General Benjamin Butler is really the first one for the United States who recognizes and sort of accepts the argument that some of these people fleeing have been saying and allows them into Union lines as what he calls contraband of war. This is
Right.
how his legal justification. And so from that point on, this phenomenon just grows in numbers. You know, first hundreds, thousands, then tens of thousands, and then the best estimates are about 500,000 throughout the war. So about 1/8 of the enslaved population in 1860 flees in the middle of this war.
Yeah.
And
No, go ahead, please.
no,
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, in terms of scale, which is really what you asked about here,
Yeah, yeah,
it's scale in terms of numbers of people, but also across space.
yes.
So we're going to see this flight along the coast of Virginia. It extends across the border states, down the Mississippi Valley,
Right.
you know, throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. I mean, a vast amount of space. And it's something I've mapped. It's something that really, the phenomenon follows the footprint of the Union Army. So anybody familiar with maps of Union occupation,
Yeah.
they'll have a good idea of where exactly this was happening.
Now, I want you to get to the establishment of these camps in just a minute here, but for a moment, let's again remind our audience, this is a war that breaks out in obviously the late spring and summer of 1861.
Mhm.
Both sides want to keep the war limited, you know, encounters of armies on battlefields, something decisive here and decisive there that would either win or lose the war. And it is, in some ways, in retrospect, always been astonishing they didn't realize on both sides, if you put these big armies in the field,
Mhm.
and if Union armies invade any part of the South, this entire infrastructure
Mhm.
of labor, of plantation labor, of slavery, is going to begin to break apart. And what happens, isn't it, that the chaos of war, even as organized as generals would try to keep it, the chaos of war brings all these opportunities to
Mhm.
enslave people
Mhm.
to flee
Right.
if they choose to. And those decisions, again, on the ground, the decision
Mhm.
to flee over to that Union army,
Mhm.
not knowing what it's going to bring, or
Mhm.
cross the river because there's some Union gunboats, or there's a garrison of Union troops here or there. This is where this begins, but it doesn't take long till it's almost a revolution of movement, isn't it?
It is.
And you
And
call the book Journeys, which is an interesting part of your title.
well, it's a journey through a 4-year, thoroughly militarized life.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they're fleeing. This is not just a story of movement and fleeing. It's a story of claiming a place and
right,
claiming space inside the lines of the Union Army and beginning to build a new life in those places.
right.
And this is, you know, again, it's war. So what sort of places are truly secure? And not
Yeah,
many of these places would be. So it is a journey through, you know, living through a military system, military culture,
right.
and also just through 4 years of war and combat.
Yeah,
And yeah, these decisions are made with very little understanding of how this is going to play out. And yet, what I found really striking are how many people make the decision to flee with their children.
yeah. Whole families.
Entire families,
Yeah,
neighborhoods, communities,
right.
which I think is very telling because as we know about the history of slave flight before the war, predominantly male phenomenon
Yeah.
associated with
About 80% we think of all runaway slaves were probably male. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Because it's so risky, and no guarantee that this was going to lead to anything permanent. But the fact that from the opening days, people are bringing their children told me that they were viewing this differently. They saw, for all the chaos of the war and all the uncertainty, they still thought this was a better bet, I guess you could say.
Right.
This was their moment. This was the time. If there was going to be any time, this was it.
Do you think, your book shows some of this evidence, in fact. Do you think some of them were in certain ways prepared for this out of their own theology, out of their own faith, out of their own practice of religion, that somehow there was going to be a liberation one day? Now, I'm not saying, everybody just dropped their hose and everything and fled to Father Abraham's army, but this expectation that this kind of chaos of war could be a sign to some of these people. There seems to be evidence of that, particularly when they get to the camps.
Yeah, well, they're not quickly deterred by setbacks. They're not quickly deterred by encountering a Union soldier or officer who is less than friendly and, wants to perhaps treat them like an enslaved person. We can talk about all the sorts of hardships that they encounter, but what I did find striking is a continual analogy between their experience and that of the Israelites, which of course runs deep in African American culture and
in Exodus, and you find that Exodus language in the freed people's own.
They talk about, well, this is like the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, and it's going to maybe take us years too. And so what it does is it doesn't make it necessarily easier to handle some of the setbacks, but it gives them faith that what they are hoping for and what they believe they are moving toward might still be there.
And so how do the camps begin to evolve? I think you say eventually there's evidence of as many as 300 of these all around the rim of the South, and especially out in the Mississippi Valley. Some of them huge operations, some of them small. How do the camps start coming about? Is it just because the Union officers don't know what else to do, or because the government becomes aware that they're now responsible for this?
Right. Well, they evolve, first of all, and it kind of emerges and evolves very organically from just the fact that, in Fort Monroe, Virginia, there's now several hundred people living there who have to occupy some kind of space. So a lot of these begin in a very ad hoc, improvised sort of way. The refugees sometimes can receive some sort of cast-off shelter tents. They might be worn out tents from soldiers.
But it was always military issue stuff.
Right. There's always some military issued stuff. Yes. And we can talk about food too. Food rations are an important part of that. But there tends to be, so things start very ad hoc, and then there's almost what I detected as like a life cycle of some of these camps that begin in a very improvised manner. And then over time, if they're in regions that are more isolated from active combat, and they have basically the protection and the stability to start evolving into something a bit more permanent. And that's when we start seeing the tents getting replaced by newly built shelters, cabins, so forth, sometimes with lumber that the military might provide, but very often with whatever these men and women are able to take from a local town. They might sort of rip apart a building, or they're grabbing whatever they can. Like bamboo in one place and so forth. So they do evolve, and in some of those places where they really are distant from active combat. So one example, Northern Virginia, Arlington,
Yeah.
property of Robert E. Lee
Right.
evolves into what looks like, from the diagrams and some of the photographs, looks like a village. I mean, it's got, the housing and, streets and roads and parks and churches and schools. And I don't mean to make it sound like it's, this great,
Shangri-La. Yeah.
right, exactly. I mean, it's
And,
built,
and that's the one Harriet Jacobs worked in, isn't it?
yeah, Harriet Jacobs.
The famous author of the slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Yeah.
She was there working with the New York Quakers.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Quakers had come down, and she was there and in Alexandria, Virginia. But
Most of these camps, as they evolved,
mhm.
were run by the military, right? Run by the Union Army. And this is a fascinating part of your book. It shows how this military bureaucracy, which is itself coming into existence overnight practically, nevertheless now has to adapt
Mhm.
to not, fight the war, of course, but they got to adapt now to create these places. And they even created the Bureau of Negro Affairs, or
In some places.
yeah.
This is a really interesting thing. You mentioned before, we're talking about, sort of the surprise of this. And, some of these US officials, it's really amazing how surprised they were.
Right.
Right. It seems like they should have known this was going to happen.
Yeah.
But certainly it was going on in a smaller scale in previous wars. I mean, enslaved people had fled during wars. It's just been a path.
Hadn't they read anything about the Napoleonic Wars, or the 7 Years War in Europe? I mean, whole villages got transported. I mean, maybe they hadn't read about it. Maybe
not. Maybe not. But a constant refrain in some of these Army officer papers is how surprised they are, and then it's I'm overwhelmed. This isn't what I signed up for. Right. What do we do about this? And it's again kind of an improvised beginning.
Yeah.
That some Army officers try to do as little as possible because I've got better things to do in their minds.
Yeah, my first job is to go fight the Confederates. I don't want to deal with all these runaway slaves.
Right, exactly.
They find that with time, they don't have a choice.
Right. In Virginia, they try, General John Dix at one point, he says, well, maybe the answer is to send them all north. Get them out of our way is basically what he's saying. And the northern governors, No,
politically, that wasn't going to work.
They did not, no, that was not going to work.
Right.
Different officers respond differently. Some were abolitionist minded. And so there are some that rise to the occasion and realize, oh, this is actually a moment where I can, act on my principles. And
this is what we came here to do.
So there's a lot of variance.
But there are others who are adamant the other way.
Right. And there's some that, they will defy Union policy and expel enslaved people. No, you can't come into my line. So, this is why when we talk about the great scale of this phenomenon and how it spreads across space,
mm-hmm.
it plays out very differently in all these different places, which is part of what makes it complicated. But to back to your question, as far as the bureaucracy goes, over time, just like the camps themselves, over time, there is a little more formalization of the bureaucracy that really becomes the basis for the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yeah, this is the tryout for the Freedmen's Bureau of Reconstruction. That's
you can really see the early roots of the Freedmen's Bureau here. And so, in some places, in some geographic departments of the Army, they create their own Bureau of Negro Affairs. In other places, they just create a position called some places it's superintendent of contrabands, superintendent of freedmen, and this is an Army officer who assumes that position. So that evolves over time, but it's very different from place to place, and not a lot of consistency.
This is the place I think I have to ask you about your sources. We historians love our sources, and we love to talk about them, but this is crucial here.
Yeah.
This becomes, as you show, an extraordinarily well documented phenomenon, doesn't it? There's an enormous kind of paper trail
Yeah.
because it's being done by armies.
Yeah.
And although you still get frustrated, there's not enough about this camp and that camp, and what did they really look like, and where did the food come from, and so on. But this is really quite well documented, isn't it?
It is. It is. I had no idea when I started
Yeah.
what record keepers the Army.
Yeah. Oh,
I,
nobody records things like armies.
oh my gosh. I knew soldiers,
Yeah.
wrote a lot because they wanted to write home and so forth.
Right.
I didn't
Right.
realize that there were clerks and aide de camps and people whose job it was to
Yeah.
write down every order in triplicate, or record every person who receives a food ration, or
Yeah.
every person we employ, record information about them and their payment. So once I started digging in and seeing that, I started to realize the true potential for somebody who is interested in the social history of this war, and in particular the social history of emancipation, that these military records were far more rich than I ever thought. I mean, the most striking thing is, for the first time, here's the federal government recording enslaved people by name in a very systematic way. We think of the federal census. You look at it for 1860, it's hash marks for people, but here now people are named. And what these records did for me was, they didn't provide that great cache of words of firsthand narrative account. There's a little of that, but they didn't. But what they did do is they gave me a sense of how people moved around.
Yes.
Where each record records somebody in a particular place at a particular time. Maybe they're in the commissary warehouse getting rations, or maybe over here they're working for the quartermaster, and you can start piecing that all together and begin to see the story of that person's life.
And sometimes the free people are writing their own letters, and you find those too. Let's go down to that granular level, because I just want to say for our audience that this book is not just a linear history from here to there. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you also have an interesting literary strategy in this book. You chose 3 particular sites in this myriad of possibilities, and then you chose 3 particular sets of people by name, about whom you can reconstruct a lot about them. And it gives us, in fact, you even use the people as sort of narrative interludes in the book, which is beautifully done, by the way. But your 3 sites, and I want you to just talk about it and explain how you made these choices: Hampton, Virginia, Helena, Arkansas, and Camp Nelson, Kentucky, which isn't too far from where you live. And then these amazing people. Bring us around to Edward and Emma Whitehurst, Eliza Bogan and her husband Silas Small, and then Gabriel Burdette. So we get this vast story of scale, but we also get to hone in on place and people.
Right.
How did you make these choices, or did they kind of happen to you? And why those places?
Yeah. Well, maybe I should start with what really drew me to this, or what I was thinking when I got started. And I was a little bit naive. I didn't honestly realize what a complicated subject it was going to be. And maybe, I think we all say that, we always think it's simpler when we get started.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What always struck me was, here is an emancipation that plays out in a war. So we have people who are fleeing from slavery, but on their way to freedom, as they're trying to find freedom, they are living with an army. They're living in a war with their children.
Yeah.
And so my really simple question was, what was that like? What was it like to experience that? How does one go from slavery one day to the middle of a war, then into, Reconstruction? I just, that middle piece of it, I really had to try to understand. And I wanted to understand in a very day-to-day sort of way.
Mhm.
And that's the social historian in me.
That's the good social. Yeah, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
that's the social historian in you. Right, right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to know kind of, how it looked and how it felt and how it smelled and,
Mhm.
all of this. So I just kind of plunged in, and this is where I was a little bit naive. I really thought that this camp phenomenon was going to be a pretty uniform story across space. I assumed kind of what you asked about. I
Mhm.
assumed that there was, a lot of coordination centrally,
Yeah, if the Army's going to make camps, they would kind of all look alike, right?
and it would be kind of more sort of a little bit of a top-down affair.
Right,
And that just was not it at all. And
right.
this felt like chaos in the archives, keeping straight all these places and why was this happening here, but this is happening here at the same time. And
Mhm.
why are some people experiencing true liberation here and other people are getting sent away over there and
Right.
all of this. And so that's when I realized this is a really local story.
Yeah.
um
And freedom itself became a local experience, didn't it?
Very much so, very
Yeah.
much so. And again, and it's not driven just, I should point out, it's not just driven by the Army's lack of centralization. It's by the people themselves pushing in particular places and building these camps themselves, and they're the ones that are giving it some pretty unique character from place to place. So it became a local story, and I realized I had to root this book in particular places. And but I had this ambition to, I mean, maybe again we all have this, I want to write a definitive account. And let me just say, I think there's a lot more to say. So I haven't written the definitive account, but that was the ambition.
I
So
love the humility. It's always a good thing.
And so I knew I wasn't going to just write about one place. I still wanted the macro level story. I wanted people to walk away from this book getting a good feel for the whole phenomenon.
Mhm.
So how do I do that while being sensitive to place? And so
Yeah.
that's when I realized I had to somehow weave together multiple places. I also knew, and this is the social historian in me, I wanted to focus on particular individuals. I knew that from the get-go. I didn't know who
Mhm.
exactly,
Mhm.
but I knew that I wanted to get a sense of how people made the choices they did on a daily basis.
Right.
And, you know, again, it's getting back to how do you experience war? We know war is something that can change dramatically from day to day.
Mhm. Oh,
So then
yeah.
how does the Emancipation Proclamation change dramatically from day to day if it's hooked to a war? So
Your book is really a different variation on that old classic saying about the fog of war.
mhm, yeah,
This is the fog of war, but not about generals and colonels and soldiers. It's about the people being liberated in the midst of all of this.
right, right. It is exactly.
But why those three then? Hampton, Helena,
Yeah.
Arkansas, and then Camp Nelson, Kentucky. They're
So
different regions and they're different times in the war too that you're
right.
concentrating on.
Well, that's part of it. So time and place, they're
Yeah.
of course the great variables of a historian, and I wanted them to be in this book too. And
Right.
so that's why the narrative unfolds over place, but unfolds over time as well. And I realized that I was not going to be able to narrate this book with three places all across time. I
Right.
didn't have, I didn't think I had the chops to do that. So, and keep the reader from getting confused.
Yeah.
So I kind of knew I had to locate them in time. And so I chose places that I felt reflected some really key developments or just key moments
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
big story. So I begin, I mean, where you have to begin, I think, in Eastern Virginia,
Right.
Fort Monroe, where the very first people are actually coming into Union lines.
Right.
Then I extend that story and really talk about the first year of the war there.
Right.
Um, and again, I'm not saying the first year everywhere looked like that, but
Hmm.
it
No.
did bring into play some of the early problems of the Union Army in grappling with this new responsibility. And so then I wanted to get more into active combat
Mhm.
and the way in which these refugees from slavery are becoming part of the combat apparatus, not just
part of the war itself.
Yeah, and
brought
are
up the
fighting.
army. Yeah.
And this is, I mean, this is where we see kind of the, the war really becoming an extension of the fight of slavery, or if you think of slavery as a state of war, I mean, you can kind of see the Civil War as an extension of that. And so I want to look at combat, and the Mississippi River Valley, is a place where not only do we see a lot of Black troops, but we also see some of the greatest concentration of these camps. So that was an interesting place to look at how these people are really immersed in active combat. And then I shift to Kentucky. Kentucky's interesting because it is the place where legally slavery remains the longest. Kentucky's a state, for those people out there who might not know, that was still legally a slave owning state until the 13th Amendment, till December 1865. So there I wanted to use Kentucky to look at, it's kind of the bookend here, the end, whereas Virginia's the beginning. Let's look at the end, in the last place where slavery was legally destroyed. What does that mean for the people who had lived there and were trying to become free in a place that really, it was happening so slowly. So those, that's
call it emancipation in slow motion.
Yeah.
Good phrase. I like that phrase.
Yeah. Well, that was Kentucky. I would say in some ways that characterizes how I tried to approach the book, which was to slow things down. The day-to-dayness, because I think we often do.
Emancipation was never a moment.
It was not one moment, and
it's always a long process. And
we rushed to the Emancipation Proclamation and then rush off. And so I wanted to kind of again slow that down. But that's how I got to the places.
What about the people now? Who were the Whitehursts, and who was Eliza Bogan? She's amazing.
Oh my gosh!
Start wherever you want there with your choices. And to the audience that hasn't read this book yet, but you should read this book, Amy uses them as interludes to then get down on the ground in real people's experience. And so how'd you make those choices?
So I spent a lot of time researching these places. I spent a lot of time trying to see, were there any people that sort of emerged from that research, emerged from the story? And what I was really doing was, as I was doing the research, keeping, if people want a technical answer here, I was keeping a database of people.
Sure, exactly.
And, keeping track of all the places they were going and what I knew about them. And then I was seeing like what sort of stories are beginning to emerge and whose story, might I be able to really probe and explore. So
this is great, by the way. We're showing people here how historians actually work. So go right ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is definitely a book of, I don't know when Microsoft Excel came around, but it's just definitely an Excel book. I used it a lot for this, but. So Emma and Edward Whitehurst, they were enslaved around Newport News, Virginia, when the war broke out. And what I first learned, one of the first things I learned about them is that they first make their way to a camp around Newport News, Camp Butler, and then they eventually make their way to Fort Monroe. So they show up at Fort Monroe a little over a month after the very first enslaved people had showed up there. So they're among the earliest people nationwide who are fleeing slavery. And one of the first things I learned about them is that when they fled, they had this trunk full of gold and silver coin. And I remember thinking,
they have a trunk of treasure with them. It's
whoa. I mean, first there's the logistics of that, and so forth. But of course, there's the question of how did they get it and how they accumulate it and what were they planning on doing with it? And so that sort of led me out to learn that Edward had been a hired out slave before the war, and he was in one of those situations where he could keep some of his wages and he saved, and he was probably saving like others did to purchase his freedom, purchase that of his wife. So instead, now war breaks out, and they're not going to use this money to purchase their freedom, because now they're going to seek it out this other way. They're going to run and flee to it.
Right.
And so, but what their story was interesting to me about is thinking about how a population coming out of slavery from the get-go tries to support itself financially. You know, how are they going to work? How are they going to build a new life? I mean, it's of course one of the first considerations of
Right.
anybody.
Right.
And they do initially get employed by the Union Army, working in a local hospital.
Uh-huh.
But pretty quickly, within a few months, they take their money and they set up a store.
Uh-huh.
They set up a store just outside Fort Monroe in Hampton.
Right.
And I remember learning that and thinking, wow, that's not the first thing I would have thought. I just didn't even think about that as being one of the first things somebody coming out of slavery would do. But of course, it was brilliant because,
The Freedmen store.
yeah, I mean, it's for other freed people, but also they were, potentially selling to soldiers. That's a whole other story. But,
Yeah.
Here's a place where the white population of Hampton had largely fled the region, and the stores shut down. And then here comes all these Union soldiers.
Yeah.
So there's a market for new stores. So in some ways it was really smart. So I explore and follow their saga, their journey, becoming independent proprietors. What were they selling? What were they doing? And they faced some pretty big setbacks, connected to the fact that they are so, they're very much a part of this military sphere.
But they're vulnerable. They're very vulnerable.
They're very vulnerable, in part because all those soldiers there who should be a good market for their goods, they don't always want to pay for it. And they don't always want to respect the fact that—
And where's the police they could go to if they get, robbed or screwed by some soldiers? The soldiers are the police.
They are, right. They're all part of the same, there's the provost marshal, but they're part of the same organization.
Right.
And, some of these soldiers just can't wrap their minds around the Whitehursts being free people and being free people with a right to own property.
Right.
So, some of the military officials, the Whitehursts, when they open their store, they actually bring some of the food that they've harvested from their plantation. And this is true with people who are fleeing into Union lines everywhere. They're bringing a lot of stuff with them.
To
start their new lives. And there are many in the Union who think that that's not their property.
Right.
That was their owner's property. This is Confederate property.
Yeah.
And therefore, the U.S. Army needs to confiscate and seize it.
Yeah.
And so they're vulnerable to that, to people coming and saying, well, that's not yours, and they take it.
Yeah.
And so I do tell, I don't know how much I should give away of their whole story.
No, you don't have to tell the whole story, but it is amazing how much of it you were able to put together, though.
Yeah. Well, they, part of it is the materials I could find on them. With every interaction with the U.S. Army, those clerks are recording it somehow.
Yeah,
so,
right.
It was possible to find them. But there's also a lot to learn about the Army itself and what was happening. And when you put kind of the Whitehurst timeline and story along with the Army's, you can start filling in a lot of gaps of their story and sort of figuring out what was going on around them. But I will say that, what they would learn is not only how vulnerable they were to individual soldiers, but vulnerable to the changing nature of military campaigns. And summer of 1862, this is the Peninsula Campaign.
Right.
George McClellan's leading his troops up the peninsula to Richmond. This might end the war, and of course fails. And they come back down the peninsula to Fort Monroe. The soldiers are hungry. and they are ready to ransack the store, which they do.
Yeah.
So
Wiped out, in effect. Yeah.
wiped out. Yeah.
All right. If you don't mind, tell us about Eliza Bogan. This
Sure.
incredible woman who's, what, in the 1820s, her owner is from the coast of North Carolina and emigrates in
Yeah.
the southern westward movement and the domestic slave movement, all the way out to Arkansas.
Mhm.
It becomes a huge cotton planter.
Right.
And Eliza is part of this whole long saga.
Yeah, I mean, she takes us into the Cotton South. So we
Right,
see
right.
the way in which this whole this war makes its way into the Cotton South. But yeah, so she was forced as a baby.
Yeah, she's born in North Carolina, right?
Born in North Carolina, but as a baby was brought out
Yeah.
to Arkansas, and it's not even clear if even her mother was with her. So it's not clear who she. Yeah, but she had her sister.
Yeah.
And so she is harvesting cotton. She's a field hand.
Right.
So she's experiencing all that physical strain. And her owner,
200 pounds a day.
Yeah.
You even have a record of that. She was picking 200 pounds a day.
She was, clearly being watched and surveilled. Her owner back in North Carolina had actually been charged with cruelty.
That's right.
Against a couple enslaved men who belonged to somebody else. He was acquitted, big surprise, but still, there he was back in his home county in North Carolina, brought up on these charges. I mean, clearly this was a man, who did not hesitate to be violent. Okay, we'll say that. So that's what she is growing up in Arkansas experiencing. And
she's about 30 or early 30s when the war comes, I would guess.
Yeah. And by then, she is clearly building a family was obviously very important to her. And she got married, had a child, and that husband died. We don't know the circumstances of it, but slavery, there were a lot of things threatening the life of an enslaved person. Let's just say that. So then she gets married again, and that husband's owner takes him away to another county. So she's lost 2 husbands already. By this point, she has 7 children. She now has a 3rd husband, and the war comes, and Union comes in 1862, and then they're gearing up for the Vicksburg campaign the summer of 1863.
Right.
And that's when they start recruiting Black men to serve, and her husband goes off to serve. And, she's really torn. She's got 7 children.
Yeah.
Her sister, I found this out in a pension record, a military pension record. Her sister tried to beg her not to go to follow her husband, but she did. Yeah. And so Eliza Bogan goes off to find her husband in Helena, Arkansas. She travels from, it's about 10 or 11 miles into his encampment. And
he's in a Black regiment by then, right?
Yeah, he's in what would become the 46th USCT.
Right.
So out of Arkansas.
Yeah.
And she takes up residence in the refugee camp there in Helena. She lives some with him and some away. Yeah. His regiment leaves. And basically what the war becomes for her, it's like a series of these really hard choices.
Yeah.
That are pitting her desire for family and being together with her family against safety.
So, and the lines between the war and civilian and army and civilian in this story are very blurred. I mean, right? There's almost no line.
Well,
she goes to the war to find her husband and then stays.
Right. She does. She, she's technically a civilian, but one of the things that I explore about her is how she decides that as his regiment moves and heads down into Louisiana and Mississippi, she could stay where she is in Helena, Arkansas, she could go up to St. Louis because the Union is trying to move some of these refugees there, but she decides, no, I'm going to follow that regiment. I'm going to go find them.
Yeah.
And I know that she makes her way down the river and finds her husband's regiment. And I still wish I knew more detail about, you know, how she did that and how she found him exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and what sort of boat did she get on, and
Yeah, that's right.
so forth.
But you had to stop and write the book. You couldn't keep looking, right?
Yeah, I think this is it's not going to be found, but anyway, so she follows him and throws herself into a war zone. She's following this regiment. She's there, you know, in moments when they're involved in active combat.
Right.
And she interestingly joins the regiment, and this is the language that she used, that she joined the company, his company, as a laundress. And which would mean that she would be a nurse. You know, laundress really meant doing a lot of different things, cooking and so forth. But she uses the language about being sworn in to the company. So she
really? That's right.
Yeah. So she really becomes part of this military unit. And so I use that to explore the way in which Black women you know, became part of the combat apparatus, and you know, even identified, as she's almost doing, as a combatant.
Yeah.
And I think that raises a lot of questions about Black women's military history in the war, which, you know, there's so much more to explore along
And
those
it was far more than just Harriet Tubman on a gunboat in South Carolina. This was all over the South.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
So then who is Gabriel Burdette? He's your third case.
Yeah.
Back in Kentucky.
So
he's a great story too.
Oh my goodness. He's one that, at least here in Kentucky, we should know more about, but well, now we do, I guess. But so he it was from Central Kentucky, and he was one who became a minister in slavery, clearly preaching, probably in secret, but at some point his preaching became visible to white people in the county, and he was brought to the church of his owner, local Baptist church, and began preaching to the enslaved people who were being brought to the church. It was one of those biracial churches with the heavy white supervision of Black preaching and worship. And so he was a preacher, and he at one point you know, gets in trouble with that white church because, and I only know this from a record book that says that he's about to be you know, punished for slurs against the church, and you know, essentially assuming, I can't remember the language now, but is assuming a status that he, you know, should not assume. So he's probably, you know, drifting into a more anti-slavery Christian message in the church.
Pushing the envelope.
Yeah. And so anyway, so that's his backstory. I mean, he is somebody who is searching, when he is searching for freedom, he is searching for religious freedom, a space to be able to worship openly and freely, and to establish independent churches. And he eventually makes his way to Camp Nelson, Kentucky. What he finds there is that, and what became evident to me, is that religious worship was one aspect of life in these camps that the Army took a more hands-off position on.
Yeah.
You know, this was not as heavily regulated as even food or shelter. But, you know, when it came to religion, they sort of almost looked the other way. Right. And so he had a great deal of freedom to start preaching in this camp. But there's a lot more to his story. He would go on to have a position, be appointed to a position, getting back to bureaucracy. He would be appointed an assistant superintendent of colored refugees at the camp. And, you know, he really, like so many Black ministers did, his position as a minister really led to, a position of leadership in other affairs, and
Yeah.
eventually he would get involved in politics after the war. But what he shows us at the end of the war, and what his story reveals, is even as he is preaching pretty freely, it's mostly to men.
Ah,
And because this is a place in Kentucky, again, the last place to emancipate, this was a place where the Union, as late as 1864, was expelling women and children and not letting them come into this camp.
mm,
And so he is really wrestling with the fact his wife is not there, his sister-in-law,
mhm.
and so forth, and is there when there's some really tragic scenes of women and children who keep coming and
Right,
getting sent away,
right.
sometimes under some pretty horrendous conditions and violent conditions. So
This is one of the things your book shows about all of the camps, but particularly the places you focus on. And I'd actually like to get you to talk about this. You have chapters about shelter, you have chapters about hunger,
mhm,
you have chapters about even clothing and the basics of life. I mean, how did people make life in these places? But you
mhm,
have a final chapter on the theme of loss,
mhm, mhm,
which I thought is in some ways the best part of the book to me, because again, it takes us into this story of a human tragedy here. Um, you know, I don't know. We have some rough estimates now for every, I forget now, is it 10% at least of 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 people who escaped into these camps probably died there. You got a medical story, you got a health story, but there's a story of human loss that you get to. Talk a bit about that, if you would.
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, you know, we often think of emancipation as a story of gain, it's a
Yeah,
gain of freedom,
yeah,
but
it's a glorious achievement. It is,
but
but
loss goes along with it.
yeah,
And, you've already mentioned with health and the fact that some people don't even survive and they lose family members. And Eliza Bogan, not to give too much away, loses her husband.
yeah,
But what I also get at in that chapter is that what had happened in a lot of these camps, as I said before, they're claiming a space on which to build a new life.
mhm,
Literally. I mean, they're
mhm,
literally building the infrastructure of a new life, houses and churches and
yeah,
schools and places for family, and building new communities.
right,
And but what that all kind of depends on for the long term is holding on to that space and holding on to the land
yeah,
on which all of this was built.
yeah,
And so here comes the big problem at the end of the war,
yeah,
that these camps are largely on the same confiscated and abandoned lands that the Union, now at the end of the war, there's like 800,000 acres that is in the Union's possession at the end of the war in the South.
right, yeah,
Now it becomes this great political issue.
yeah. What do you do with it?
What is the Union going to do with this land?
Yeah,
And what we are familiar, historians are familiar with this question, this political question, and familiar with the fact that freed people wanted to claim some of this land, or
yeah.
maybe all of it, but at least some of it.
They had
But
worked it for generations.
they had worked it for generations, and there are so many reasons why land was essential to
Hmm,
freedom.
hmm,
For economic reasons, for political reasons. But what I try to show in that chapter are, in some ways, the social reasons
yeah,
that, this land is not just theoretical and in the abstract out
right,
there.
right,
It's land that they've been living on for 1, 2, 3, 4 years,
right.
and have built these new communities and really see that this is a new home.
They've claimed it anew, haven't they? By building these villages, in effect,
Right.
contraband villages. Yeah,
Absolutely. And
yeah,
so here is one universal across space, is that people residing in these places, particularly the ones that were sort of more advanced and built up,
mhm,
they mobilize to try to save the land.
Right.
And, they make arguments, of course, about, we were the loyal ones in this war. How can we even think about, just reverting this land back to the disloyal, to the
Right.
Confederates?
Yeah.
They feel a sense of right, but
Yeah.
they also feel a really strong sense of place and connection to these places, which I know sounds a little strange because, again, they started, these were refugee camps and there was a lot of hardship, as we've talked about, but this was also the potential for a sort of remapped South of the future of these Black villages and communities.
And they had to imagine what were their choices, to go back to their former farms and plantations. Depends. To go north, that was never really an option presented to any of these people. These camps, interestingly enough, became home for some of them, and they were going to claim it, weren't they?
Exactly. They were going to
Didn't
claim
get
it.
to claim it. The camps were all, in effect, what, abandoned or demolished?
Well, so what happens is, eventually, the political story is more familiar. Here comes Andrew Johnson,
Yeah, right.
who really turns the tide here and forces the Freedmen's Bureau to get in the business of reverting these lands back to the Confederate owners. And what that means in practice, and this is something I don't think we had fully reckoned with before, is that means actually destroying a lot of these buildings, pushing people out of these communities and tearing down all the physical remnants of them. And so there's some really, tragic stories of how that plays out. And it's a large reason why today, there's the big question. We haven't even talked about memory, which I'm talking to David Blight, and we haven't talked about memory, but
I'm getting to that in the Q&A because people are asking about it.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, this is not a history that has really been very prominent in American memory of the Civil War, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But losing the physical remains of this, and pushing everybody out, that helped essentially, literally erase this.
Well, I want to welcome our audience to send their questions into Q&A. I've already got a dozen of them here, so I'm afraid we better transition to this Q&A before we lose our time here. So I'm going to start right there where you were. I'm going to put two questions together here. One is from Jonathan Jones, and the other is from Karen Van Dree. Karen asks, are any of these slave villages still existing? Is it possible to go see them? But then Jonathan had just asked Professor Taylor, I'm sorry. No, that's a different question. I'll get to that one. Here, I'm sorry. This is the question from Yolanda Burgess. Forgive me. I'll get to Jonathan's later. She's asking about the Camp Nelson site, which has become now a national park site. She's wondering whether you've had any role in the development of that national park site. And to what extent Camp Nelson has become a public history site. So
that's really tied into the first question too.
Sure.
You can see these places. So
yeah.
So I started working on this book. Oh gosh, I guess it was like 15 years ago or so, but maybe it was less. I hope it was less. But anyway, what I was really struck in that period of time were the number of local preservation projects that were getting underway in particular places and communities to try to find a way, in the absence of actually having a building or a collection of houses that still exist, in the absence of that, what can we do to remember this history? And it was actually really eye-opening to me that in local communities, residents of communities, some of them are descendants of people who had lived in these camps during the war. But there was a lot going on in a lot of these places to get this history remembered. Mitchellville, South Carolina, that's on Hilton Head Island. Helena, Arkansas. Corinth, Mississippi.
Mississippi has a site.
Yeah. And so I met some of the people along the way in Hampton, Virginia, a wonderful organization calling itself the Contraband Historical Society.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
that has done a lot of work to get the story told. Their original president was an opera singer, and she created an opera. I mean, some really, yeah, and they were important in lobbying to get Fort Monroe to become a national monument, and it became a national monument largely because of this history, African American history. So to answer the question of what you can go and see today, there are sites. There are ways that these local communities, and now the Park Service is coming in some of the places, have figured out how to remember and locate this history. Helena, Arkansas, they've created a place called Freedom Park, right where the camp was. And it's a really interesting site. They have in the concrete paths, they have footprints of all different sizes, like kids, adult. And when you sit there, it's a really tranquil spot, and you sit there and you see the footprints. It's really evocative of the people who once walked that ground.
Oh, I need to go there. That's in Helena, Arkansas, which is on the west side of the Mississippi, of course, right?
Yeah, right on the river. So yes, you can go to some of these spots and get a sense of the landscape, which I actually think, I mean, there's a big environmental sort of thread that I pull on in the story, and I think it is important to see the landscapes that they were trying to set up a new life on, some of which are in pretty low-lying, flood-prone areas, and it gives you an idea of how difficult that was.
And imagine the day, Amy, when we would have anything resembling the preservation of battlefields in this country that would be preservation of the refugee camps of former slaves, even a few of them designated by the National Park Service, would be a triumph. Thank God there's at least two of them now. I got a lot more questions here, and some of these are amazing. I want to make sure I ask this one from Christine Keneally, who is a very distinguished historian up here at Quinnipiac College. She's a historian of the Irish famine and therefore the Civil War era. But she's just asking, what do we know about the role of Irish Americans in this process of emancipation and destroying slavery? Did this, these Irish brigades, there were lots and lots of Irish-born soldiers in the Union Army. Did that come up at all, the role of the Irish in emancipation? Because we always hear about the role of the Irish in the New York City draft riots and all of that, but what about this side of the story?
Right. Well, they're there. They're absolutely around. They are soldiers. They're part of this. As far as a distinct group, what sort of generalization I can draw, I'm going to come up a little bit short, except when, and I think this was in Virginia, I saw this, when the Army is considering what they can do with all of this labor that's coming in. Some of them are saying, and this reflects some of the shared racial assumptions between Northern white Army officers and white Southerners, but they basically say, they're going to be better than some of these Irish laborers. Let's get the Irish out of here and employ them. So there's some of that goes on.
Sure.
But hard to generalize otherwise. Maybe that would be a good question for somebody to look into.
Well, there's so many elements to that. I don't want to get into it all either, but it was a Irish-born Confederate general named Claiborne who actually started I'm sure you know, Amy, started the effort within the Confederacy in 1864 to try to get the Confederate government to start some level of emancipation so that they could control the post-war era and so on. But it's a complicated story, the place of the Irish on both sides here. There's so many other good questions. Lois McMillan, who is one of the great coordinators of Gilder Lehrman Institute's teacher program, and she's, I'm sure, probably in Oregon, that's where she lives. She's asking here, is there evidence of Union soldier letters that you encountered that of men who would join to keep the Union together but changed their minds on the future rights and citizenship of the enslaved people. In other words, did you encounter any of this famous story? Now, guys from the North went to war to save the Union, and they didn't want anything to do with slavery, but they end up being liberators of slaves.
Mhm.
And in the end,
Yeah.
in many cases, proud of it. But
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And
all
this
over the place. Yeah.
this is why, I think I mentioned before that, every soldier and officer was a little bit different,
Yeah.
but they also change over time.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of evidence of sort of self-reflection on some of their parts about, some of it might make your eyes roll, but they express surprise at, how quickly some of these refugees are picking up reading and writing, or other things, and I just had no idea, and are acknowledging that now that they are encountering Black people in a significant number, it's really tested their racial assumptions and their racism, and some of them become self-aware of that, but not all. That's for sure.
Well, okay. I'm just going through. I'm going through quite a list of questions here. Well, here's one that asks, how much? This is a historian's question, I suspect, but it's from Larry Kortzik. How much did the first and second confiscation acts actually fuel the refugee camp development? Now, those were acts. The first was in the fall of '61. The second in the summer of '62. These were acts for our audience out there that were done by Congress, not by the president, allowing the liberation of slaves as property of the enemy.
Yeah.
Were they a factor here in the creation of these refugee camps, or were the refugee camps just going to happen anyway because the refugees were there?
They were part of the story, but I would see this as kind of a reciprocal sort of dynamic. So it's not so much that the policy comes in and encourages more people to flee and more camps to be formed. And sometimes it's the reverse, that it's the movement of enslaved people who are continually coming and pushing the hand of the Union that forces the Union to react. That's clearly what happened with the first Confiscation Act. This is very much a reaction to Benjamin Butler's original decision to allow enslaved people in. In fact, Butler gets a little upset because he doesn't think the first Confiscation Act goes as far as he's going in Virginia. But anyway, so I see a lot of the policies a little more reactive to the movements of enslaved people. I think that they really were the force behind this. And so that's something I try to emphasize in the book.
Yeah, if they weren't there in the numbers that they became, these laws wouldn't have been passed or wouldn't have been necessary, I suppose you could say. Here's an interesting question about your writing. I love this question. Professor Taylor, your prose and storytelling methods in your book are so moving and exceptional in the field of Civil War historiography. Oh, okay. Do you have any writing advice that you'd be willing to share with new and younger first-time authors? I mean, you're a social historian, on the ground stories, but you write narrative too. So
right. That is a great question. I feel like keep working at it. That's the advice, right? Keep reading good writing and keep working at it. But that's, as a social historian, I think that and this is why I focus on individuals too. I came of age in the 90s. And so we already had a lot of those community studies out there, and a lot of studies of people that talk about it in the aggregate, and they're not very narrative.
No, they're not. Social historians lost hold of narrative for a while.
Yeah, and I think ironically lost hold of people.
Yeah, that's right.
Individual people, and
with names and lives.
I didn't realize exactly what I was trying to do with these three stories until I saw it articulated by the novelist Tayari Jones, who wrote An American Marriage.
Right.
Yeah, so anybody who hasn't read it, you should read it. But it's about the effect of mass incarceration and wrongful conviction on a family. But
So
she,
that novel led you to a certain kind of literary
now,
sensibility that you
so
could apply?
I didn't read the novel until after I wrote this book, but
Oh, I
something
see. Okay,
says
okay.
in it. So what she talks about is advice a mentor gave her.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And it was to write about people and their problems,
Hmm.
not problems and their people.
Oh, good.
And when I
Good.
read that, I thought that's what, you know, I didn't figure it out until that point. It really articulated what I was trying to do here,
Yeah,
to really let the people guide as
yeah,
much as possible. Everybody's got a story. There's a
yeah.
story in everybody, and
Oh,
let them
that's so
guide.
true.
And instead of our inclination to sort of, if we put the problems first, we tend to sort people into the categories, and
Mm,
we shove people's lives into a category and smooth off the rough edges of their lives. But I
right.
think, keep that, the person's going to lead you to a story.
That is such a beautiful answer. It reminds me of a quick anecdote. A few in our audience might possibly have been at this event, but I'd say it's at least 10 years ago, maybe more. I got Edmund Morgan to come out of retirement, the great Ed Morgan, colonial American revolutionary historian here at Yale. Ed was already 90, I think, at that point, but he came out of retirement and hiding, although he just lived up the street, to be on a panel with Annette Gordon Reed.
Mm.
Because Annette had just published her Hemmings of Monticello, and Ed had reviewed it in the New York Review of Books. And I thought, let's just get them together. And here was Ed Morgan. And I had graduate students, and many people had never even seen Ed. He'd been retired for 25 years or something. And there he was, the Ed Morgan, little, tiny man. But in the Q&A, somebody got up and asked this very question. They said, Professor Morgan, what advice do you have for writing history? He said, keep the people in it. People. You
Oh,
got to have people.
wow.
And he did it in his impish little way, but I've never forgotten that. It was like, people.
Yeah.
That's all he said.
Wow. Wow.
Anyway, but that was your answer too. That's great. There are a bunch more questions here, but I think we probably need to wrap up. But I want to get you to do the wrap up here. You know, again, this is a story that has been there in the sources to be written at some point. We always seem to think, emancipation is this colossal process, but how do we get at it?
Mhm.
As you know, back 3 and 4 decades ago, the documentary history of emancipation started coming out in the volumes that
Yeah.
all rooted in those documents in the National Archives. But now we do understand, it seems to me, because of a book like yours, a book like Chandra Manning's, and a couple others over time, that emancipation is really the greatest result of this war.
Mhm.
It isn't just, it freed 4 million Black people, but it didn't just do that.
Mhm.
It freed America from its history.
Mhm.
It freed the Constitution to be redone, rewritten, refounded, and so on. So I'd just like to hear your reflection on that, the sheer significance of this story. And you do take your story into the post-war period a little bit because your people lived into that period. This is as important a turning point in American history as we've ever had, isn't it? Your thoughts on that?
I mean, what more revolutionary moment of social change have we experienced in this country
Yeah,
in this short, really condensed period of time?
yeah,
Um, I mean, it's really incredible, and I think when you follow the people and you follow individuals, you can really see that really vividly.
yeah,
Um, I mean,
yeah.
somebody like Gabriel Burdette, who, is preaching in this supervised white church, 10,
Right.
10 years later, he is, going to the Republican convention.
Yeah. Right.
He's
Right.
a delegate from Kentucky. He's
Yeah.
vice president of the state Freedmen's convention.
Uh,
I I mean, that's, oh, and he's on the board of trustees of Berea College, the first Black member of the board of trustees. I mean, just in that short period of time.
Well, he's a prominent leader, and his leadership was essentially born in Camp Nelson.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so, I mean, in that sense, emancipation in this moment and these times in the camp, you know, I talked about loss and things getting wiped away, but there's a lot that lingers and live on.
Yeah.
And certainly his ability to assume a leadership position grows out of that. There's a, you know, infrastructure of churches. I mean, the churches are hard to put down. I mean, just by wiping out a camp. You know, these independent churches continue, and of course, so crucial for the long term in African American history. And so this is the most revolutionary moment, and that's what really drew me to this subject from the beginning. I mean, I think you've said it very well already.
No, you're saying it better.
How
I
meaningful.
wonder what in this book may have led you to a next project, or I mean, did you feel anything was unfinished, or what is the next project?
Well, there's a couple things. You might not know it from reading this book, but I came of age really as a digital historian. That was when I was in graduate school. I worked on the Valley of the Shadow project and
At UVA with Ed Ayers, right?
I actually think there's a lot of imprint of my early digital history days in this book, and sort of the way I went
your
out.
Mapping. There is in your mapping.
There's the mapping and digital history. You know, the digital technology is allowing us to sort of connect the dots of people's lives a little more easily than we could before, you know, with all of these databases out there with newspapers and ancestry.com.
Right.
Anyway, so I'm getting back into digital history in a more explicit way, and working on a project that grows out of this, where my students and I are mapping the migrations of people into Camp Nelson from where they came and then beyond, and asking the question of what can we see, and how might we think about this period of Black migration a little bit differently when we get down to the level of some of these individuals. I mean, think about with the Civil War. I mean, we track a regiment, every little movement.
Right.
And where it goes. Well, let's do that with some of these soldiers and their families. And so we're in the middle of that right now. And then my next book will move into Reconstruction.
Oh, that's great. And maybe we will have national park sites where we can trace them. How about that?
That would be great.
That would be great. Well, Amy Murrell Taylor, thank you for doing this book talk with us here. Thank you for writing this book. Congratulations again a year later on winning the Douglass Prize. And I'm sure our audience out there is going to join me in this applause, but thanks for doing this. It's great fun. And hope to see you again soon, somewhere in person at a conference next year or something.
Thank you and the Gilder Lehrman Center so much.
Well, you bet. And thank you to everyone for coming tonight. Thanks for tuning in and joining us with this book talk with Amy Murrell Taylor. Thank you all, and good night.